On October 19th, the Georgia Bulldogs will travel to Austin, Texas to face off against the Longhorns in what should be, in my opinion, the biggest game of the college football season. And I'll give you 5 reasons to support that.
You are Locked On Longhorns, your daily podcast on the Texas Longhorns. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Locked On Longhorns, the show. Jonathan Davis, your host. Today's episode of Locked On Longhorns is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Remember, terms apply. On today's episode of Locked On Longhorns, we're discussing the mammoth matchup on October 19th between the Georgia Bulldogs and Texas Longhorns. Over the next 2 segments, we're talking Texas basketball. The second segment, dates and times to be announced later, but we now know who Texas will play in conference play this season in their first year in the SEC, in the Moody Center and on the road. We discussed that. And then in the last segment, the Texas basketball transfer class ranked 15th in the country by 24/7 Sports. Now, this was not a subjective list, right? They were just ranking the top aggregate scores based on how many transfers you brought in, right? But I needed motivation this morning, so I still got a chip on my shoulder regardless. All of that and more on today's episode of Locked On Longhorns, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So as I'm recording, I get a glimpse of the date, and, it's May 14th, right? And, summer's coming up. You're going to be having fun, right? Time's going to fly by. You're going to be wearing less and going out more. As Drake said, maybe I shouldn't be quoting Drake at this point since he just got bodied in a rap battle for the second time in like 3-4 years. But, it's Drake, one of the GOATs regardless. We're still going to be listening to, whatever song he puts out over the summer. But, like I said, before we know it, we'll be looking up and, it'll be August 31st and, Texas will be playing against Colorado State. And when we look at it, over the last decade, we haven't had too many opportunities to be this excited coming into a season, right? Of course, it's the University of Texas is, one of the most passionate fan bases alive, right? So we're excited coming into every season, but this one feels different, right? Like last year felt different. It's different when you can come into a season and know you have one of the best teams in the sport, right? It's different when you can come into a season knowing that if everything falls your way, you could win a conference and national championship, right? For the first time, at least the national championship wise, since 2005. So, everything is in front of this University of Texas team. And I think for everybody associated with the 40 acres, it's really exciting, right? And when you talk about excitement, nothing gets more exciting than this October 19th matchup between the University of Texas and the University of Georgia, right? When most people have talked about the national championship contenders coming into this season, right? Based on the rosters and what has been done in the transfer portal, 5 names come up over and over again, right? Georgia, Texas, Ole Miss, Ohio State, and Oregon, right? And so when you get 2 of these teams matching up in the back half of the season, right? The 7th game of the season, with everything at stake, these teams being in the same conference, possibly playing for a chance at the SEC championship game, and then they could rematch in the SEC championship game with the 12-team playoff. They could rematch again in the playoffs. And then obviously with Texas being their first year in the SEC, this is a game that will mean a lot, in the foreseeable future. So you're talking about one of the biggest games in college football this year. And I'm going to go a step further and say this will be the biggest game in college football in the regular season. And I'm going to give you 5 reasons why. The first one is both teams have a realistic chance to come in undefeated. It'll be the 7th game of the season for both teams. And when you look at it over the first 6 games of the season for both teams, they have a really good chance to go undefeated. Now, both teams have 2 tests, right? How big the tests are, is subjective to you. When you look at it, Texas will face Michigan on the road in week 2, and then they will face Oklahoma and Dallas in week 6, right before they play Georgia the next week back in Austin. And then when you look at it with Georgia, they're playing Clemson in week 1 in Atlanta, which is, a home game, and it's Clemson. I'm not even sure what they are at this point, but I'll still give respect to Dabo Swinney. And then they face off against Alabama in week 4 on the road. Now, obviously, it's Kalen DeBoer. It's not Nick Saban anymore, but Alabama still has a really talented roster. I expect that to be a mammoth game with, everything that happens in that rivalry. So when you look at it, Texas should be able to go into Michigan week 2 and beat that Michigan team in Sharon Moore's second game. Jim Harbaugh's not there anymore. J.J. McCarthy's not there anymore. Blake Corum, they've lost a lot of talent. Still a really good football team, still a gritty football team that's going to be tough to, beat on the road. But most people would expect Texas to win that game. And then I think when you look at the Red River rivalry, of course, anything can happen in Dallas. But you're talking about an experienced veteran Texas team that is loaded at every position compared to an Oklahoma team that really got ravaged this offseason. And Jackson Arnold will be making his, 5th or 6th 6th start in college football, maybe 7th or 8th when he goes against Texas. So, especially when you look at what happened last year, I expect Texas to get revenge in a big way, even though that game is always close. And then Georgia against Clemson, they're going to win that game in Atlanta. Georgia, Alabama could be tough, especially on the road, but I give Georgia the advantage in that matchup, at least this season, while Kalen DeBoer is still figuring things out. So if you look at it, both teams have a realistic chance to come into this game undefeated, right? In the 7th game of the season, in the back half of the schedule. And this is a game that's going to market itself, right? You don't need to add, too many bells and whistles to it. But if both teams can come in 7-0 to this game, or 6-0 to this game, I should say, it just adds that much more aura to what I think is the biggest matchup in college football this season. The second thing is, I think that this game will go a long way in terms of determining who is the Heisman winner this season. When you look at it going into it, the two favorites for the Heisman this year are Carson Beck and Quinn Ewers, right? And based on the outlook of both of these teams, I don't see a scenario in which either one of these players will be knocked off that Heisman pedestal, right? When you look at it, Quinn Ewers is going to lead one of the best offenses in the country. And if they're winning at the level that I think they are, which they'll be, undefeated or have one loss going into the 7th, 8th game of the season, then Quinn Ewers absolutely will still be one of the leading Heisman candidates, right? Like I said, quarterback, University of Texas, Austin, leading one of the best offenses in the country. That's tailor-made for a Heisman candidate, right? And then when you look at it with Carson Beck, he's going to be the starting quarterback on one of the best teams in the country who probably will lose at most one game this season, right? And so just because of that success, you're going to be a leading Heisman candidate, right? When you get them to match up against each other in the October 19th game with all of the implications that come from it, it could simply come down to who performed better in that game or who came out victorious in that game that gave one of these players the edge to winning the Heisman over the other. Now, I do think Shedeur Sanders will be a Heisman candidate. We've already seen he's the betting favorite to go number 1 in the NFL draft next year. And then there's some other players who will have great seasons, who will make a name for themselves and enter themselves in that conversation. But I think kind of with Shedeur Sanders, he's kind of embraced that villain role, or he's made himself the villain, right? Whichever way you want to look at it. And I think that has pros and it has cons, right? It has pros in terms of marketability, right? You're going to be polarizing. There's going to be millions of people that love you, millions of people that hate you. But when there's millions of people that hate you, that usually affects you in a negative way, right? And I just have a hard time seeing a bunch of people voting for Shedeur Sanders to be the Heisman, winner, regardless of what he does on the football field. I want to say regardless of what he does on the football field, but I think Colorado will lose 3-4 games this year at least, right? Like on the high end, I think the, best case scenario, they go 8-4, 9-3. And I think because of that, regardless of what Shedeur Sanders does in terms of balling out, there's just going to be a lot of people that are human beings that don't care for Shedeur Sanders. Now, should they, vote for an award like that? Probably not. But we saw T.O. have to wait 3 years to get in the Hall of Fame, right? So that tells you that they don't care, whether it's subjective or not. So I do think in a scenario where, Shedeur Sanders has rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, that could affect his ability to win the Heisman this year. I think we're going to have a, end-to-end finish where, start to finish where Carson Beck and Quinn Ewers are the legitimate Heisman contenders, the top 2 Heisman contenders all season. And I think the matchup on October 19th could be the needle that pushes either way, right, in terms of who wins it. Who wins that game on October 19th likely decide who wins the Heisman between Carson Beck and Quinn Ewers. The third thing is the winner likely punches their ticket in the SEC championship game, right? When you look at the conference schedule for both of these teams, I don't expect Georgia to lose a bunch of regular season SEC games. They haven't lost any in the last 3 years. And then when you look at it, Texas obviously has some tough matchups, with Georgia being one. Obviously, Oklahoma and Red River, anything can happen. You have to go on the road to Texas A&M. That's a tough rivalry. You have to go on the road to Arkansas, and so those are going to be tough games. But we expect this Texas Longhorns football team to be able to navigate themselves well in those matchups, right? That's why we said they're a legitimate national championship contender, right? And so if you look at it, I think right now the 3 favorites to play in the SEC championship game are Ole Miss, Georgia, and Texas. And Georgia has to play Ole Miss and Texas, right? And so the winner of this game likely punches their ticket in the SEC championship game, because that's a big hurdle that you've gotten over, and it gives yourself more margin for error. If Georgia loses to Texas, they really can't afford another SEC loss to essentially guarantee themselves a spot in the SEC championship game, right? Because then Texas and Ole Miss can outperform them, especially if Ole Miss beats Georgia. And same thing with Texas, right? If Georgia beats Texas in this game, now you have to make sure that you go out and beat Oklahoma in a neutral site. You have to make sure you have to go out there and beat Arkansas and Texas A&M on the road to give yourself enough margin for error to still make it in the SEC championship game with a loss to Georgia. Same thing with Georgia if they lose to Texas. So I think that this game, the winner likely punches their ticket in the SEC championship game, because this is the biggest hurdle on both teams' schedule this season. And if you can make it past Georgia, or if Georgia can make it past Texas, everything else should be downhill. You potentially get the rare 1 versus 2 matchup in college football in the regular season, which has only happened 25 times in college football history. The last one being 2022, Georgia versus Tennessee, 1 versus 2. And that matchup didn't even live up to the hype. I think Georgia won that matchup by 3 scores. The last one before that was Alabama and LSU with Joe Burrow and Tua Tagovailoa. So 1 versus 2 has only happened twice in the last 5 years, right? I want to say it's too rare. It seems like it happens every 2 to 3 years, but it doesn't happen every year in college football. But this year we have a realistic opportunity to see it, right? If both teams come into this game at 6-0, right, in the 7th game of the season, absolutely, I think this matchup will be 1 versus 2, right? And I think that adds extra lore to the matchup, right? Undefeated teams, 1 versus 2, SEC championship berth on the line, Heisman candidates, Carson Beck, Quinn Ewers. It just adds to what is already the biggest game in college football this season. And I think this will be the game that spawns one of the best rivalries in college football moving forward, right? There's already some buildup and anticipation in terms of the fan side because of what happened in 2018, right? Texas wins the Sugar Bowl against Georgia, and then what's happened since then, right? Texas gets a new coach. We kind of fall off a little bit before we get back up, but we're now back up right in time to face Georgia in this matchup in 2024. And then, of course, Georgia, just went on to win 2 national championships, right? Nothing crazy. But when you look at it moving forward, right, we're now in a different scenario, right? Kirby Smart, one of the best coaches in college football. Georgia's not going anywhere anytime soon. Steve Sarkisian, one of the best coaches in college football, knock on wood. I don't believe Texas is going anywhere anytime soon. So that means that every time Texas and Georgia match up for the foreseeable future, it will have heavy implications, some of the biggest implications in college football. Every time that Texas and Georgia match up moving forward, it should be a game that could potentially determine who makes it to the SEC championship game. They'll be facing off in the SEC championship game, or they'll be facing off in the college football playoffs to see who gets to the national championship or wins the national championship. Those 3 scenarios should describe every Texas and Georgia game moving forward, right? And so if every Texas and Georgia game has those type of stakes attached to it, then it's going to be one of the biggest rivalries in college football. Not to mention what the game means this year. Then you already talk about going to Georgia next year with Arch Manning as your starting quarterback. And oh yeah, his 2 top choices out of high school, Texas and Georgia. So that's what the next 2 matchups mean. We already have that, we already have that storyline written out, right? In terms of Texas and Georgia, the next 2 seasons. And like I said, for the foreseeable future, as long as Texas and Georgia stays on this same trajectory, every time they match up, it will either have conference or national championship implications, as well as potential Heisman Trophy winner implications. This will be one of the biggest rivalries in college football moving forward. And the October 19th game will be the first installation of, like I said, what will be one of the biggest games in college football for hopefully the next 10 to 15 years. A quick word from our sponsors, and then we get into the Texas basketball team, who they'll be playing on the road and who you'll be able to see in the Moody Center next season in their first year in the SEC. Today's episode of Locked on Longhorns is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just a job board. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing so many hats and might not have the time or resources to hire. LinkedIn is constantly finding ways to make the process easier. They even just launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions, making the process even easier and quicker. 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. So post your job for free. Remember, terms and conditions do apply. All right, getting into the Texas basketball team, it's just an exciting time all around, right? With new, right? New can, definitely be exciting. Change and new can be unsettling for some people as well, and I get that, right? I think what we haven't talked about enough, right, with all of this excitement going into the SEC, is what it means leaving the Big 12, right? And I know a lot of fans, are ready to leave the Big 12. A lot of fans have convinced themselves that the Big 12 was out to get us, and in certain scenarios, there's some credence to that argument potentially. But there are a lot of, big, I don't want to say big rivalries, but big matchups and regional rivalries. And, your peers that go to different schools, that those matchups really don't mean as much anymore. So in that same sense, we've talked so much about going into the SEC and what it means and how exciting it is. But change can be unsettling, right? And, like I said, my little sister goes to Baylor, right? I don't know when a Texas-Baylor matchup will ever be relevant again, right? If it is in our lifetime. So, that's kind of the unsettling part of change. But then the good part of change is we're going to the SEC, right? We just talked about it in football, being able to play Georgia back-to-back years in the regular season, right? LSU, Alabama, all of those matchups, and the same thing in college basketball, right? You got schools like Kentucky, right? Arkansas now with, Coach Cal there, Tennessee with Rick Barnes, Bruce Pearl at Auburn, right? You have those type of schools, Nate Oates at Alabama, who just went to the Final Four. You have those type of matchups night in and night out, right? In terms of your college basketball conference schedule, even though the Big 12 is the class of college basketball right now. And I, didn't mention it, but of course, there's some lure if Texas plays Ole Miss for obvious reasons. So when you look at it in terms of what Texas will face in conference play, their first year in the SEC under Rodney Terry and staff, conference play will run from January 4th until Saturday, March 8th. So, because times and dates have not been established yet, I'm not sure who Texas will play on January 4th or who Texas will play on Saturday, March 8th, but that will be the conference basketball schedule. That's when it'll run. Not sure exactly when the, college basketball season starts in terms of non-conference or like the first game of the season, but we know it ends on Saturday, March 8th. All 16 SEC teams play each other at least once during the regular season, right? So Texas will play all 15 of the other SEC teams during the season, some once, some twice. But yeah, they'll play every single team during the season. 3 teams are played twice, 2 of which are permanent opponents. If you're a Texas fan, it is not hard to figure out who Texas will be playing twice every season and when that will rotate. So, of course, Texas will play Oklahoma and Texas A&M more than likely every year, home and away. And then this season, I think the rotating opponent is Arkansas, who Texas will play in the Moody Center and in Arkansas. So, traditional rivalries that made a ton of sense. That's something that the SEC said that they wanted to preserve and wanted to highlight with Texas and Oklahoma going into the SEC. And they definitely did that this year, right? And then when you look at it, the SEC tournament will be in Nashville on March 12th through March 16th. So those are the days. Get your hotels ready. Get your flights ready. I will be in Nashville. It's one of my favorite cities. It's so fun. I was in Nashville a couple months ago for the SEC tournament on accident because my sister went to Meharry. She's a pediatrician, so she's headed to residency in Chicago actually in a few months. Wish her luck if you're listening. So yeah, I was in Nashville for a few months ago for her match day, which just so happened to be during the SEC tournament. But I got to see the festivities and how they do it, the bells and whistles and all of that, and it's such a fun time. And just especially seeing like everybody in their college stuff. You've seen all the Kentucky shirts, the Tennessee shirts, A&M, all of that. Like it's just such a good fun time where everybody's coming together, and obviously everybody's rivals, but everybody's having a good time in Nashville celebrating as well. So it should be fun. And, if you're a Texas fan, they say the basketball, we don't travel for the basketball team. So let's kill that narrative, right? And let's, head out to Nashville this year and, propel Texas to hopefully, a SEC tournament championship in Nashville between March 12th and March 16th. When you look at who Texas will play this season at home and on the road, I think the Longhorns got a very favorable schedule coming into the SEC. And I think that, they're battle tested with, a lot of these players. I want to say a lot of these players, but, just coming over from the Big 12, you would expect the SEC to be a little bit easier, right? There's still some really good teams in the SEC, but it's not essentially the night in and night out grind that you're used to in the Big 12, right? So not only do I think you're coming into a conference where you're not going to be playing as intense a level of basketball every night, although Texas should still bring that Big 12 intensity to the court. You're also, right, based on what I see, right, coming into the season, obviously this is preseason, a lot could change, but your schedule looks pretty favorable, right? So, at home, you get Alabama, right, who just went to the Final Four. So you get Nate Oates, one of the best teams in college basketball. You have the opportunity to play them at home, right, which will be good for you with that Moody Center advantage. You got Arkansas, Coach Callender's first year at Arkansas, obviously a traditional rivalry. Not sure how much that will mean, but that'll definitely be a game that'll be buzzing, in the Moody Center, if not for Coach Cal and some future NBA players coming into town. And then also that'll be a big game for Tremont Mark, right, who has an opportunity to go off against his old school who he just came over from. Auburn, Bruce Pearl, one of the, premier programs in college basketball. That'll be a fun matchup in Austin. You get Georgia coming over on the basketball side. Probably won't mean as much as the football game does. Kentucky, even though that's not the same Kentucky right now because Coach Cal just left. You get Mark Pope, who was at BYU last year, and you get a chance to avenge that bad loss we had against BYU. But that's a familiar matchup, a team you played against, or at least a coach you played against last year. So that game can mean something. And it's still Kentucky. It's still a blue blood, right? It still means a lot, right? Even if it's a transition year or the first year without Coach Cal. You get Missouri at home, Oklahoma at home. Obviously, Rick Barnes returns to Austin, Texas again, so there's going to be a lot around that matchup. And then Texas A&M at home. Anytime these two teams play, I don't care if it's underwater basket weaving, it's going to be intense, and they'll play in basketball in the Moody Center, which would be a fun game. Definitely will be sold out in advance. I'm sure people will be lined up, sleeped out, donuts and coffee days in advance. Then when you look at it on the road, this is why I think that the schedule is favorable. You got to play Arkansas on the road, right? We can do that. That's going to be a tough environment for sure. Tremont Mark going back, that'll be a good game for him, hopefully. Coach Cal at home is going to be buzzing. That's a really good basketball arena. That's a really passionate fan base. And Texas is going to have a tough game on the road in that environment. Then you got Florida on the road, right? So good basketball team, but, not a game that Texas can't go in there and win. LSU, not a top tier basketball program at this point. Texas should be able to go in there and win. Ole Miss, obviously Texas was going to have to play Ole Miss at some point. I do thank the SEC schedule makers for not being thirsty and having Chris Beard come back to Texas and come back to Austin in the first year of the SEC. But, Rodney Terry and staff will be going into Ole Miss to face off against Chris Beard. And obviously that matchup will mean a little bit to a little bit of people, right? Then you got Oklahoma on the road. We've beaten them, 7 straight times now, so who cares? South Carolina on the road, Texas A&M on the road. That'll be a tough matchup for sure. That'll be buzzing. And then Vanderbilt on the road. So in terms of your road matchups, the one that really sticks out to me is Ole Miss because of, the Chris Beard situation. Arkansas, they're probably the best team in this group. And then Texas A&M because of the historical rivalry, but Texas will have a better team than Texas A&M. So I really look at this conference schedule. I say it's pretty favorable for the Texas Longhorns. I think, obviously Alabama, Auburn, Kentucky, Arkansas will be at the top of the list in terms of SEC teams, but I think Texas should be able to come in right away and put themselves in that class, especially what they've done in terms of roster building, which I'll talk about in the next segment. So Texas should be one of the premier teams in the SEC coming into this year. And I think they got a favorable schedule going into the first year in the SEC. Now we got to see the dates, how many games how much time is in between, the travel schedule, all of that. But in terms of the opponents and what we know right now about their rosters, I think Texas has a very favorable schedule going into the first year in the SEC for the men's basketball team. A quick word from our sponsors, and then I'd be overly dramatic about Texas being ranked 15th on a list in terms of their basketball transfer class. All right, as I mentioned earlier, this is somewhat performative, right? Like I just needed a third segment, and I saw that Texas was ranked the 15th transfer class. Now, originally, like my emotions were high. My blood pressure went up. Not naturally, like I have high blood pressure, but like it went up when I saw the article. I'm like 15th, But I am. My burnt orange glasses do come on when it comes to the Texas basketball team. They definitely come on when it comes to Rodney Terry. I won't lie to you, and if you listen to the podcast, you know that. So yeah, I saw 15. I'm like, huh? Like after we just brought in 15th. So I had to click on the article. They got me. And then I realized like it was just, how they do the football recruiting rankings where, West Virginia can go out and, recruit 50 players in a class and have the number one class because it's just, in terms of like the aggregate score. Like if you brought in 8 players compared to a team that brought in 4 players, you're going to have a higher ranked class, right? I didn't look at like the average player or anything like that. I just looked at the list and got fake mad and then wrote it down in my notes because I needed motivation and that motivated me. So when you look at it, 24/7 Sports has Texas ranked as the 15th transfer class. Context to that, once again, I've just already added it that it was not subjective. This was not them saying, I think Texas brought in the 15th best group of players. It was just how they were ranked prior to committing to their respective schools. And then the collection of players that, Texas brought in gave them the 15th best aggregate score, at least right now in the transfer portal. But I don't expect them to bring in any more players. So if anything, they would drop. not move up. And then more context, or to add more context to the context I just added, 5 of the teams ahead of Texas on this top 15 list brought in 6 or more players. So Texas only brought in 5 players in the portal this offseason, right? 5 teams ahead of them on the top 15 list brought in 6 or more. So naturally, they're probably going to have a higher score if they brought in more players. So really, theoretically, Texas is in the top 10. Right? When you look at what Texas got in this class, I think one of the most dynamic 3-level scorers in the nation, and Tremont Mark, a lefty too, so it's a little bit unorthodox. But you're talking about scoring from the 3-point line, scoring from the mid-range. He does such a good job of getting to that wing and getting to his spots, getting his shot up, right? That left wing or that right wing off the dribble. And he can certainly get to the rim and finish at the rim with both hands on both sides. So you're talking about a player that, legit can score 30 at any point, scored 34 against UNC last year, North Carolina, scored 35 against Texas A&M last year in a thriller. So he could put the ball in the basket, one of the best scorers in the country, one of the most premier players in the transfer portal. And Texas got him as the headliner of their class. Then you talk about a true floor general in Jordan Pope, who, thankfully to football, he probably stays at Oregon State if it wasn't for realignment. So, shout out to football, and everything that comes with that. But, a true floor general, 17 points per game last year, 3 assists in his sophomore year, can play effectively on or off the ball. He was one of the most efficient 3-point shooters and scorers off the ball last season. And he's a true, veteran floor general point guard, right? That's the modern basketball. Be able to play off ball screens or play on the ball off that high ball screen. He does both at a high level. The perfect modern stretch 4 in Jason Kent, who attacks the glass, really good rebounder. I think 7-8 rebounds a game last year. Really good 3-point shooter. I think 38%, 39%, maybe even 40 on limited opportunities, stretching the floor as a 6'8 power forward, right? That's something you were missing with Dylan Mitchell. Just the ability to stretch the floor, period. Even with the mid-range, even with that, baseline jumper. But now you're talking about somebody in Jason Kent who can knock down the 3-point shot, right? And he does such a good job in terms of basketball IQ, cutting to the basket and playing in a free-flowing offense, right? At Indiana State, he did that. He'll be doing the same thing at the University of Texas. 95th percentile cutter in the country, averaging 1.7 points per possession on cuts. So essentially, every time he cut, it was worth 2 points, right? You bring him in, that's a huge addition to your offense. And like I said, the perfect modern stretch 4 in college basketball. Then you're talking about a backup point guard, backup guard, combo guard in Julian Larry at Indiana State as well. One of the best offenses in the country, shoots over 40% from 3, maybe even be 45% from 3. I didn't get a chance to look at it again, but it was definitely over 40% from 3, 40% from the left or right side, right? Some people got spots, right? Like they can only shoot from one side, from the other side, they're broke. Nah, he cashes in from both sides, right? Like 40 plus left or right, right? And had a 22% assist rate, right? That's really good. I don't have really numbers to compare it to, like what would be a bad assist rate, but just know 22% is really good last season for one of the best offenses in the country. So those are the 4 players that headlined your class, right? Then you brought in Malik Presley, a San Marcos kid who spent a year at Vanderbilt. Like I said, Ronnie Terry struck gold with, the Vanderbilt transfer who's from the Austin area with Dylan Dessous. So might as well try it again with Malik Presley. But, I think it's just filling out the roster with high upside depth, right? If he doesn't play, if he ends up transferring again, then it was low risk for you because you're not relying on him on a high level on this basketball team. And if he ends up being a really good player for you, all right, then everybody wins. So I think that, of course, because of the aggregate score, some teams, bringing in more players, some teams literally building their whole roster through the transfer portal. Texas was ranked 15th in the country based on that metric. But I think when we look at impact this season, how the 4, I should say, because I don't expect, Presley to have a big role this year, but how the 4 transfers they brought in Julian Larry, Jason Kent, Jordan Pope, and Tremont Mark will affect this basketball team. I think they'll have a top 5 impact, regardless of where 24/7 Sports ranked them prior to their commitment. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Locked On Longhorns, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Hook 'em. Peace.